everybody. Thanks for spending your day with us. We really appreciate that. We know you had a lot of choices you could have made. You could have helped a friend move. You could have gone for ice cream or go for a bike ride, but you chose to be at a jazz concert. So congratulations. You're off to a great start for the week already. That first chart was 2 Seconds to Midnight and featured Ella and Mitchell and Zach and Asher and Eli on the solos, and some really nice rhythm section work from the trio behind me here. So give those folks a little snappy love. This next chart is about as different from that as you could have asked for. It's a kind of like a hip-hop changes, laid-back swing chart, and it's going to heavily feature our pianist, Bercy Fredrickson. Here's Sagebrush by Annie Booth. Such a cool chart. Our next chart is equally different. This is a funk jazz waltz, not a real common jazz genre, so it's a funky 3-time, and it's called Updraft. And like the first song that I didn't say earlier, but this next one was also a student choice. They played this for the All-State 910 jazz band, and this one didn't make the final cut for the jazz concert in February for the All-State students, and there's several of them in the band here, and they were like, oh, you definitely got to do this one. So here's Updraft. thank you. As with all the other directors, we all have our day jobs. Well, I guess we all have our day jobs, and every week we come together with these super fun young musicians, and it really is a highlight of the week. And especially in the springtime, where there's more activities and more concerts, the folks are picking each other up. We'll have a rehearsal with 4 kids absent because of band concerts and whatever, and we make it work. And that's kind of the mantra. We hope parents and students that you all take your experiences of MYJB back to your home school. That's the key. You gotta pass it on. That's jazz. We've been passing it on for over a century, and now it's your turn to pass it on. And I hope that as you think about your school bands in the next couple weeks here, don't let them slide. Don't let them slide. Keep that bar nice and high so that we can finish strong here, not just with MYJB, but with your homeschool bands. We're going to finish up our portion and turn it over to MYJB 2 here with a Latin chant called Agua de Beber. NYJB3, everybody! Stick around, we got more music for you.